Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's the lust for gold behind enemy lines when I put Brian G. Hutton's Kelly's Heroes against David O. Russell's Three Kings. And man, this was a wild one to get through because both of these movies were, they're good in their own right, and what's even crazier, they both have the same basic plot, but in two different wars. So first up, we have Brian G. Hutton's Kelly's Heroes, starring Clint Eastwood, Telly Savalas, Don Rickles, and Donald Sutherland, among many others. Carol O'Connor being probably the most notable in the outside of that group that are the title group known as Kelly's Heroes. And basically, what it is Clint Eastwood's character. He finds a Nazi who's got a bunch of gold on him and stuff. And because, of course, this is near the end of World War II, where they're like, wrapping this shit up. They're, kicking ass and taking names, or really creaming those Nazis' asses and shit. But they find Clint Eastwood finds this gold, and he tries to get Telly Savalas to go along with him, and he's reluctant at first. Big Joe is Telly Savalas's name in the film, and of course, what's crazy is you have two actors that were in The Dirty Dozen, which came out a few years prior to this, which is a way better movie. But Telly Savalas being one of them, and Donald Sutherland being the other. But Telly Savalas is not really the asshole in this film that he is in The Dirty Dozen. He's just a loud, boisterous, kind of sergeant that's fucking, he's really passionate, but he cares about his men type shit. But then Clint Eastwood actually persuades him to go along with the shit. And you got Don Rickles, who's believe his name's Crap Game in the film, and he kind of adds the comedic relief, but it's a very restrained Rickles. Actually, his character's kind of a bitch. He's like kind of the smart guy that knows the numbers and shit and all that good stuff. And then you got Donald Sutherland, who looks like he's supposed to be in an entirely different movie. He looks like a hippie and stuff. And that's one of the flaws of Kelly's Heroes, is that it doesn't necessarily know what kind of film that it wants to be. Of course, they're going to find this gold that's in a bank behind enemy lines. It's very much kind of like a Western as well, and of course, this isn't the first time that Clint Eastwood's been looting gold during a war. We'll see the good, the bad, and the ugly for that shit. Among many others, even before that, he was always hunting gold in the Old West. And the music by Lalo Schifrin, which is probably the best thing about the film, is very, there's times where it'll kind of slip into a Western theme. There's even that scene where they're kind of like facing off with that tank that's guarding the bank and shit. And the one thing that it kind of irks me about Kelly's Heroes is just how like dehumanizing it is of the whole like of war and shit, because and I guess you can do this in a World War II film, because anytime you're just mowing down Nazis with gunfire, it tends to, like, nobody tends to question it, and nobody really cares about like how the Nazis were feeling type thing. But there's really no danger in the film. Granted, there's a certain level of clusterfuck that's in this film, but it just doesn't have that sense of like we could easily fucking die, and nobody does it. Like Don Rickles gets shot in the leg, and a lot of fucking Nazis and a few innocent people get fucking killed in the process. But they run off with the gold in the end. They kind of have the cover. It makes it look like they're advancing and shit. And of course, Carol O'Connor might have the best performance in the movie. He definitely hams it up a bunch, even restrained for Carol O'Connor. He's not as hammy as he was in Point Blank. But anywho, he's that whole thing. They think he's De Gaulle, and he's like, De Gaulle isn't even in this war, all that. So even that shit's kind of lame. But the film itself tries to do what Patton did the same year, where it was trying to appeal to the left and the right, and it kind of fails where Patton succeeded, because it doesn't really, you got kind of the hippie shit and kind of the hip lingo that's going on and stuff, that whole like, Donald Sutherland especially, with that whole, you keep putting out those negative waves, man, all that shit is like very of the time that this film was released in 1970, kind of at a time where you couldn't really make movies about Vietnam. They used them as like parables, much the same way that MASH did the same year, where it was a movie that took place in the Korean War, but it was a critique on the Vietnam War and shit. So like it, but at the same time, you got Brian G. Hutton, who like had just did like Where Eagles Dare with Clint Eastwood a couple of years prior, and that's like an old school, just men on a mission World War II picture. And so he tries to like have that duality of like the in your face, right or left wing counterculture shit of the time mixed with the right wing fucking military complex and shit. So I mean, I'm diving into the deep psychological shit on a basic ass. But even as a comedy, it doesn't play as well. And then we move forward to Three Kings, which has the same plot, only just, a little different and a way different war. Here we're in the first Persian Gulf War of the early 90s. And, the film stars George Clooney, Mark Wahlberg, Ice Cube, Spike Jonze, and Nora Dunn, and McKelty Williamson, and Jamie Kennedy, which, I mean, this is a pretty stacked cast. And Judy Greer has a small part in it as a reporter. But the film itself, like I said, it takes place in the first Persian Gulf War. And then, it's the end of the war. They got the ceasefire and everything. They're wrapping everything up. And then they end up finding Mark Wahlberg and Spike Jonze's characters, who are best friends in the film. They find a map jammed up some dude's ass. And they pull it out, and it's like, oh, this leads to gold. So they let, Ice Cube's character and George Clooney, they're like the superior officers and shit, they can get stuff done. And so they're going to go to this bunker to find this gold so they can be set for life. And so then they end up, clusterfuck after clusterfuck. Mark Wahlberg ends up captured because, motherfuckers gassing them and shit, running off. And they're dealing with like refugees and stuff. They're trying to help them. The film itself has like a way better pacing, though, than Kelly's Heroes, because for something as action-packed as Kelly's Heroes is, it kind of moves at a snail's pace, and it's like you can marvel at the pyrotechnics, but you don't really feel anything in the action. You feel a little bit more in the action with Three Kings. David O. Russell who directed the film, he may not fully understand like the use of slow motion, but he was definitely playing with camera and editing techniques to try to like make a war film that had never been made. Because of course by 1999 you had so many great war films made, because it's like, if you're not making an anti-war film, you're not making a great war film, because nobody wants to praise that shit. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do, but nothing's above critique and whatnot. And we see these three guys, four, you count Spike Jonze, they're just trying to get the gold, but then conscience takes over, and they learn a lot of shit about themselves. And whereas like in Kelly's Heroes, they kind of get away with it, everything just works out because it makes them look like they're winning even more and shit, and they ride off into the sunset with that fucking hippie ass song playing and shit. Like I said, the soundtrack's way more hip than what it's trying to be. But then you got Three Kings, which fucking just, they get away with it, but they don't get the gold type thing, but everything works out because that reporter that George Clooney's character is supposed to be escorting and stuff unfolds it all, so there's a lot of like, even that character, that the reporter chick that could easily be a bitch, she's very humanized, because it's Three Kings succeeds where Kelly's Heroes doesn't, because it manages to make a film that, appeals to the left, but could also appeal to the right if they don't think too hard enough about it and shit. So because it critiques the shit that goes on, but at the same time humanizes all people involved, even the enemy, so to speak. Where like here it's very real. We see all the fucking reality of what it looks like when you liberate a country, and it's just it ain't fucking pretty, and you definitely you're not able to just fucking bullshit your way through it and stuff the way they do so easily in Kelly's Heroes. It was mainly so Three Kings clearly wins this round. For anybody keeping score, that is 48-41. 70s are up by 7, but that lead is getting tighter again because, the thing about it is David O. Russell is one of those directors, one of the many directors of the 90s that successfully carried that torch of what 70s filmmaking was and also tried to do, and that it didn't really carry out through the 80s, because of course these guys heavily influenced by what Three Kings is basically MASH with a Kelly's Heroes plot. It's very in the acting itself is better too, because like Clooney, I believe, is a better actor than Clint Eastwood, and honestly, it's like Spike Jones adds up way more comic relief, and even Jamie Kennedy offers up way more comic relief than Don Rickles does in Kelly's Heroes. And Ice Cube's fucking great in it too, as well as Mark Wahlberg, especially Wahlberg coming off of his fucking insane performance in Boogie Nights. So you just had a lot of great talent kind of mold together, and it fit perfectly. You know, you clearly had a director that understood the material, as opposed to like Kelly's Heroes didn't know what the fuck it wanted to be. So if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. 48-41. 70s are up by 7, but the 90s win this round. You know, they keep coming back with these heavy hitters and shit. So, you know, it's a roller coaster ride, and I'm on it. I'm enjoying it. Hopefully you are too.